그럼 지금부터 오늘의 두 번째 세션인 스페셜 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 두 번째 세션 스페셜 세션의 사회는 한국국방연구원 이호령 안보전략연구센터장님이 맡아주시겠습니다. 센터장님 부탁드립니다.
네, 감사합니다. 안보전략연구센터장 이호령입니다. 여러분들 즐거운 오찬 시간 보내셨습니까? 보통 오찬 뒤에 시간이 좀 졸리울 텐데 이번 세션은 여러분들이 졸지 않을 수 있게끔 회의를 잘 진행을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 보면 이번 세션이 이름이 이제 특별 세션이라고 되어 있는데요. 왜 특별 세션인가에 대해서 간략히 좀 설명을 드리고 그리고 회의를 진행을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 한 몇 가지 이유를 꼽을 수가 있을 것 같은데요. 이번에는 한미동맹, 올해가 한미동맹 70주년인 만큼 한미동맹이 포괄적, 글로벌 포괄적 전략적 동맹으로 발전함에 따라 앞으로 향후 70년 또 100년의 한미동맹이 어떠한 방향으로 발전을 해 나가야 될 것인지에 대한 연구를 저희 카이다와 또 주요 연구기관들과 공동 연구를 했습니다. 그래서 이번 세션에서는 카이다와 미국의 주요 연구기관들과 공동 연구를 한 내용을 중심으로 이번에 세션을 꾸렸습니다. 그래서 두 개의 공동 연구가 진행이 됐었는데요. 하나는 저희 카이다 측과 헤리티지가 또 중심이 된 한미 동맹의 앞으로 향후 국방협력 발전 방향과 관련된 공동 연구가 진행이 됐었고요. 또 하나의 공동 연구는 또 카이다와 카네기 재단 간의 그런 동맹 보장과 관련돼서 어떻게 발전시켜져야 될 것인지에 대한 공동 연구가 진행이 됐습니다. 해서 두 가지 분야에 대한 그동안에 연구했던 거를 중심으로 이번 세션을 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. 제 발표 순서는 일단 먼저 카이다와 헤리티지가 공동으로 연구했던 내용 중심으로 발표가 있을 예정인데요. 제 옆으로 앉아 있는 순서대로 곰보람 박사님, 브루스 클리너, 리처드 비친거, 타렌스 로리, 클린트 워 순서로 발표를 하고, 그리고 나서 동맹 보장과 관련돼서는 저희가 동영상으로 준비된 세 개의 동영상과 최수온 박사가 발표를 하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 곰보람 박사님께서는 이번에 그 한미 간의 그 동맹과 관련된 국방 협력과 발전 방향에 대한 여러 개의 주제를 중심으로 카이다 팀과 미국의 주요 연구자들 간의 공동 연구를 했는데, 여기에 대한 전반적인 설명을 해주시고 그리고 이어서 주제별로 연구된 결과를 말씀을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 예, 곰보람 박사님 부탁드립니다.
Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you. My name is Poram. Welcome to KIDA. Welcome to Seoul. I would like to introduce the Joint Alliance Project for this special session today. Let me give you a brief background and tell you how we did the research. So, since 2017, KIDA and the Heritage Foundation have held 7 joint conferences each year, focused on common threats to ROK-US alliance, current issues related to alliance management, and recommendations for enhancing bilateral security cooperation. Each year, KIDA selected an agenda to support the U.S. Policy Division at the Ministry of National Defense. As the co-host, the Heritage Foundation helped organize a 1.5-track policy dialogue with current and former government officials, as well as experts from think tanks and universities. Heritage also provided the venue for the conference. This year's joint conference adopted a uniquely different format. KIDA decided to launch a future-oriented joint research project to facilitate policy-relevant dialogue with a wider range of experts. So, rather than hold a roundtable discussion focusing on a common agenda, experts from both countries were assigned specific topics to produce research papers. There were 2 main reasons for this change. First, there were demands to produce a more substantive outcome that could be readily adopted in policy. Second, this year marked the 70th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance, as we all know. So we decided the time was ripe to try something new. I broached the idea of a joint research project to Bruce in late 2022, then received approval from my director, Director Lee, and then discussed this with M&D. The Alliance project was launched in May, and a kickoff meeting was held online to discuss the details with all 8 Korean and 7 American participants. And in the 7 years, this was the first time the KIDA Heritage Joint Conference was organized in support of a joint research project. Now, rather than focus on one aspect of the alliance centered on one common research theme, as most research is done, our project was designed to compile chapters on 6 specific areas of defense cooperation that have been identified in recent ROK-US summits and SEMs, and also relevant to the implementation of the ROK's Indo-Pacific strategy. The topics include extended deterrence, trilateral security cooperation, defense technological industrial cooperation, joint command and exercises, maritime security, and space security. The breadth of the project reflects the evolving nature of the ROK-US alliance as South Korea grows its role and reinforces its foothold as part of the global comprehensive and strategic alliance. The frontiers of the alliance, as you all know, now cover technology, democratic values, and non-traditional security. For each topic, a Korean and American author was chosen based on their expertise and research interest. The main goal was to bring together a diverse range of issue experts, foster sustainable dialogue, as well as intellectual growth. Particularly, multiple experts from both the US and ROK were invited to co-author the defense technological industrial cooperation chapters. The aim was to promote better communication between alliance policy experts and those with expertise in the defense industry and technology. From mid-May to mid-June, the project participants were asked to draft a chapter presenting the Korean and US perspectives on the topics separately. They would answer the same set of specific research questions that include the evaluation of defense cooperation to date, opportunities and challenges, and ways ahead. The Washington, D.C. conference in June consisted of 6 closed panels, and additional issue and alliance policy experts were invited to give comments on the papers. There were agreements as well as meaningful different opinions. After the conference, the authors finalized their chapters and publication was made. What you see on the screen, hopefully, is the cover of our final report. And next, this is the summary of our policy recommendations. This report is available to KIDA people only this week, but next week it will be open to the public. The final report includes a total of 13 substantive chapters with an additional introduction and conclusion written by Bruce and myself. The introduction includes a list of policy recommendations according to Korean and American perspectives. Rather than merge them into a stylized set of recommendations, we listed them parallelly so that the readers can observe and evaluate the nuances directly. In total, I'll emphasize that 8 Koreans, 7 Americans, and more than 10 discussants and reviewers have offered their ideas for this final report. This was us in Heritage in June. I personally thank them all for their efforts. Today, we will have a presentation on 5 of these topics. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 방금 전에 그 곤보람 박사님께서 설명을 해주셨듯이 이게 조인트 프로젝트가 시작돼서 오늘 그 홍릉 포럼을 통해서 거의 이제 마지막으로 모든 내용들이 다 정리가 됐고 다음 주에 이제 발간이 될 예정인데요. 그 중에서 저희가 크게 6개 주제를 맡아서 한 측 미측이 공동으로 연구를 했었는데 그 중에서 우주 안보 파트를 제외하고 확장 억제, 한미일 안보 협력, 그다음에 방산에서의 국방 기술과 산업 협력 파트, 그리고 합동 지휘 및 한미 연합 훈련, 그리고 해양 안보에서 5가지 주제에 대해서 연구했던 거 중심으로 발표를 하도록 하겠습니다. 저희가 이 특별 세션이 2시간의 시간이 있는데 지금 저희가 또 참여자들이 많은 관계로 발표를 10분 이내로 해주셨으면 감사하겠습니다. 브루스 부탁드립니다.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here at KIDA. I often come here during my trips to Seoul because of the expertise here, particularly on defense and security issues. And I'm a firm believer in the idea that if you steal from one person, it's called plagiarism, but if you steal from many experts, it's called research. So I'm able to come to KIDA and tap into a lot of the expertise here, so it's good to be back home in a way. I'm going to be talking about extended deterrence and trying to capture not only my own paper, but also that of my KIDA counterpart, Jong Kyung-ju, or KJ. So I'll try to point out where her conclusions or recommendations perhaps were different from mine. Extended deterrence, as people in this room know, has long been really a fringe element of discussion in Korea for at least a decade. And then in the last year or so, it seemed to burst into mainstream discussion and then flared sort of in January when President Yoon had two misstatements or deliberate misstatements, which really created sort of a sense of crisis. And that spurred the U.S. administration to be much more forthcoming in transparency on nuclear strategy, nuclear plans. And then now things seem to be much better than they were. You can hardly find an article about extended deterrence in the Korean media now. But we'll see how long that lasts. So looking back a bit as to why did it flare into the mainstream discussion, and I think between KJ and I, we came up with four main reasons. One was sort of the obvious deteriorating security environment, and that's not only the growing North Korean nuclear and missile threat, it's also China's increasingly intimidating and coercive actions in the East and South China Sea, and also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which created a sense of concern or fear in Asia that a similar action might happen here with China and Taiwan. The second factor was the growing doubts about the reliability of the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee. And we'd really seen that growing, I think, since 2017 when North Korea did their first ICBM tests, where the idea being that once the U.S. mainland was under threat of a North Korean nuclear attack, would the U.S. really risk our own cities on behalf of our South Korean ally, sort of the would we risk Seattle for Seoul? The third was the fear of the uncertainties of the American electoral system, basically if Trump is reelected, and whether he would come back and resume threats to reduce or remove U.S. forces from the peninsula or even abandon our ally. And then the fourth would be South Korean national pride or wounded national pride. The idea if the United Kingdom and France can have nuclear weapons and 5 NATO nations can deliver U.S. weapons, why can't Korea? So any of that sort of brought about this sense of a growing support for an indigenous South Korean nuclear program. And as I said, President Yoon's statements, which may have been intended to pressure the U.S. or were just inadvertent comments, really brought about this crisis. So when I went back after a trip here in January, several of us went into the Pentagon and said, you really need to loosen up. There is a great sense of crisis that the doubts of South Korea of the U.S. Fortitude and resolve. So I take single-handed credit for changing U.S. policy. But one of the things KJ did in her paper was identify some of the advocacy cases amongst South Korean experts, and then she refuted them, and I don't have time to go into those. But but after the sort of the sense of crisis in January, the U.S. was more forthcoming. They in 2022, we had resumed military exercises, repaired the degradation of Allied deterrence capabilities. We resumed the rotational deployment of strategic assets. We enhanced the transparency on our nuclear strategy. We had tabletop exercises which incorporated nuclear use scenarios for the first time, and a number of other issues. So that by the time of the very successful April summit between Presidents Yoon and Biden, and then the Washington Declaration, there was a much less sense of divergence between the two countries. We obviously created the Nuclear Consultative Group and a number of other issues. So where are we now? We're in a much better situation. When I've talked to South Korean officials, some of whom were quite strident in their criticism in January were really very changed by April or May. But in a way that the jury is still out. Things seem good now. The advocates for an indigenous nuclear program, those arguments have been deflated. However, if in the future we either have continued North Korean provocations, which is inevitable, or any indication of a lack of U.S. resolve or a degradation in U.S. resolve, then the issue may come to the forefront. So really, it's right now up to the U.S. and South Korean officials, particularly the U.S. officials, on how well we convince the Yoon government in our sincerity and our resolve to defend our ally. So how do we try to prevent it from being a crisis again? And KJ and I have a number of recommendations, and I'll have to run through them, I think, at warp speed. But the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee, it not only is meant as a deterrence to our opponents, but a reassurance to our allies. And it requires credible capabilities and commitments, as well as convincing our opponents and our friends of our resolve. And if either the U.S. or Korea fail in communicating that resolve, it risks that North Korea may misperceive and see an opportunity to attack or be more coercive. So first of all, what should Washington do? We need to, as KJ pointed out, we need to align our threat perception and political objectives with each other. So if the primary concern for South Korea is the North Korean threat, and the U.S. is the growing Chinese threat throughout the region, we need to make sure that we bridge this gap in threat perception and establish a consensus on the desired objectives to be achieved on the Korean Peninsula. And the reality, though, is that the two threats, sort of the China-Taiwan threat and the North Korean threat, are more interconnected than some perhaps see them to be. Another recommendation is we need to operationalize the nuclear consultative group, and that's what's happening now. And Friday there's another meeting of the Extended Deterrence Security Cooperative Group, or whatever the acronym is, where additional discussion will take place, and there'll be further meetings of the nuclear consultative group. And that's where the U.S. has to do what we can to convince our ally of our commitment. We need to develop in that working group the aligning nuclear information sharing, planning, options, contingencies, combined exercises, and plans for deployment of U.S. strategic assets. We also need to establish a bilateral process for consulting and coordinating nuclear strategy at multiple levels of government. Another recommendation is augment our tabletop exercises on extended deterrence. So we need to continue to include nuclear use scenarios, both North Korean use and U.S. use of nuclear weapons in those exercises. In talking with former U.S. officials, they would say that in the past, when we did tabletop exercises, as soon as nuclear came into play, the U.S. would shut down the exercise. And now we need to continue that and discuss how things may play out, not only North Korea, but also U.S. use. And in those exercises, it's also a way for the U.S. to press South Korea for its thinking on nuclear use. And that by identifying not only the use, but also the consequences of nuclear weapons, that it may hopefully drive the U.S. and South Korea closer together on coordinating when we think nuclear weapons would be used or not used. Another recommendation is augment the size, scope, frequency and type of the combined military exercises. And the U.S. and South Korea have announced a rigorous and robust schedule for military exercises this year and beyond. The U.S. also has to enhance the missile defenses of our homeland. Currently, we only have 44 ground-based interceptors, and the concern is that North Korea could overwhelm them as they deploy multiple warhead ICBMs and additional launchers that they can now indigenously produce. So the Biden administration should continue the augmentation by 20 of the next generation interceptors, as well as considered replacing the existing 44 with next generation interceptors. I'm going to go quicker now. We need to increase trilateral military coordination with South Korea and Japan. We saw a lot of that come to fruition at Camp David, but that also has to be institutionalized. Now, what should South Korea do? The Yoon administration needs to develop a strategic messaging strategy to convince the Korean people that the extended deterrence guarantee is the best option rather than an indigenous program, and also upgrade its information security so the U.S. feels more comfortable sharing nuclear information with Korea. Also continue strengthening its offensive as well as its missile defense capabilities, and there's a list of things there. So in conclusion, South Korea will remain nervous over North Korea's growing nuclear and missile arsenal, their escalating provocative behavior and uncertainty over the future dependability of the U.S. ally. And so the U.S. needs to show sustained progress in incorporating South Korea into our nuclear planning to prevent another crisis in credibility. 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. 이게 연구가 시작이 돼서 어느 정도 이제 원고가 마무리되고 난 다음에 특정한 일들이 어떻게 보면 스페셜한 이벤트가 2개 정도가 발생했다라고 볼 수가 있는데요. 하나는 이제 확장 억지와 관련돼서 북한이 최근에 3,000톤급의 잠수함을 진수를 시켰죠. 거기에 한 10발 정도의 무기를 탑재를 할 수가 있고 그중에 전술핵 미사일을 탑재를 할 수 있다라고 이제 북한이 이제 선전을 하고 있는데 그러한 상황에서의 우리가 한미 동맹이 앞으로 향후 확장 억제 부분과 관련돼서 어떠한 조치를 취해야 되는 건지에 대한 것도 앞으로 주요 과제가 아닐까라는 생각이 들고요. 또 하나가 이제 우리가 위협과 관련돼서 북한의 위협과 또 대만 사태의 그런 위협과 이 2개가 또 연결이 되는 그러한 부분을 이야기를 했는데 또 오늘은 또 북한과 러시아가 정상회담을 한다라는 뉴스가 나오는 그러한 스페셜한 이벤트가 있습니다. 그러면 향후 이 위협과 관련돼서 북한, 중국, 일본과의 이러한 3자 간의 그 위협의 발전 방향과 그런 것이 향후 한미 동맹 부분에서 확장 억지 부분과 관련돼서 어떠한 또 과제를 우리가 발굴을 해야 되는지에 대한 그런 고민도 필요하지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 이어서 이수훈 박사님의 한미일 3자 협력에 대해서 발표를 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Good afternoon. My name is Soo-Hoon Lee. I'm with the Center for Security and Strategy. And for this chapter, for this specific project, thank you, first of all, Bruce and Boram, for organizing whole book. And my topic is on trilateral security cooperation. In fact, I wrote same subject with my partner, Dr. Prestup at the Hudson Institute. So for today, I organized 2 different perspectives on the trilateral security cooperation. So when I mention Dr. Prestup's policy recommendations or analysis, I'll try to mention his name first and then go on to the analysis. And also another caveat is this had been written before the Camp David. So a lot of stuff are on the Phnom Penh statement, but we didn't have time to make any progress since then. So the chapter had been published with the limits of the Phnom Penh statement. So I just wanted to let you know that before I go any further. So I'm going to touch briefly on the history and opportunities and considerations for the trilateral cooperation. And we divided into 2 regions, Northeast Asia and Indo-Pacific for the trilateral cooperations, and followed by policy recommendations. So here, before we went into writing, Jim and I had discussions on who would focus on which. So Jim had focused for this chapter on strategic objectives in the Pacific for the trilateral parties and common objectives among the 3 parties. And also, what are the areas of cooperation in the Northeast Asia and the Pacific? I myself tried to dig more into the history of the trilateral security cooperation and also classify those considerations and opportunities for the trilateral security cooperation. So when we talk about trilateral security cooperation, we often go back to TISA or TICA, which were in 1990s and 2000s. But I would like to go back to 1960s when there was a first atomic bomb test by China, and the year after, 65, there was RK Japan the negotiated framework. And plus, back then, Lyndon Johnson, back then the president, in person congratulated President Park on making this negotiation forward. So therefore, 1965, there was a basic agreement between Japan and Korea. 1998, there was the pivotal test by North Korea. And three parties, Korea, US, Japan, installed TCOG, Trilateral Coordination Oversight Group. But that had been nullified in the early 2000s. 2010, 2013, there was a third DPRK nuclear test. If the following year, 2014, there was a trilateral information security, trilateral information sharing agreement, TISA, but that has been nullified as well. So that's the brief history of our trilateral security cooperation. And what are the opportunities we can see at this point? We will better assess North Korea's nuclear and missile provocations by sharing the real-time missile data that we discussed in Phnom Penh. That's in the process of developing. And we can effectively work toward the denuclearization of North Korea. Back in six-party talks, that was multilateral. There was a bilateral between Trump and Kim Jong-un. But now, I think there's an opportunity and chances for the trilateral as well, for the denuclearization of North Korea. And I'm sure Korea is trying to become a global pivotal state. At the same time, with the US, is trying to accomplish the global comprehensive strategic alliance. That being said, Korea is trying to be the cornerstone for maintaining peace and prosperity of the region. With Korea and with the US and Japan, ROK will be able to maintain and sustain the rules-based order of the Indo-Pacific region. And what are the considerations? China, of course, is the variable that we have to think about. Recently, as our chair said, Kim Jong-un visiting Russia is a news. And of course, there could be a China, Russia, Japan, North Korea trilateral cooperation. That will be a lot of people, according to people, the new Cold War could be formed as well. I think the institutionalization is another consideration, or more of the challenge for the three parties, but that had been already taken care of. Not whole thing, but a lot of things had been happened during the Camp David. I think the institutionalization of missile data sharing and joint combined exercises, that will be another consideration for the three parties. And equal footing, that had been, I think, taken care of already in the Camp David. Cooperation in Northeast Asia, first of all. So meaning North Korea, missile defense in Taiwan. So North Korea, like I said, we're in the process of building this system for missile sharing real time. And these are the recommendations and the analysis of the Dr. Presto, missile defense. This missile sharing time, the real-time sharing North Korean missile can be developed into the missile defense system, according to Dr. Presto. And also Taiwan contingency as well. Whenever we talk about Taiwan contingency, there is a discussion of a strategic flexibility of the USFK. So that may be another topic that we'll have to discuss among the trilateral parties. That's also according to Dr. Presto. And cooperation in the Indo-Pacific area, we can base much of the results from the Phnom Penh statement, but that have been developed a lot, made a lot of progress during the Camp David, so we can refer to that. And ASEAN Pacific Islands, maritime cooperation, and also the public diplomacy. These ASEAN public islands are very important assets for the trilateral cooperation. I think there are the ways and rooms for the cooperation with these parties too. So ASEAN centrality and Pacific Island centrality, that should be taken into consideration for the three parties before going any further cooperation. So I think the most important part of my presentation, actually Jim and my chapters, is this policy recommendation. So I'm going to mention a few of the recommendations we came up with. First of all, we'll have to realize the mechanism for sharing DPRK real-time missile warning data this year. That's what's been said during the Camp David. So I think that will be the foundation of the trilateral security cooperation. And we'll have to continue joint exercises on humanitarian assistance, also on disaster relief for gaining the sustainability. So like I said, from the 1990 TCOC, 2000, 2014 TISA, we didn't have the sustainability. But from now on, I think that is the core, I think, the effort that we will have to put in for this trilateral cooperation. And also different levels of the dialogue among the Congress Diet, our National Assembly, and also among the foreign ministries, defense ministries. But thank God there have been dialogue, the discussions about this during the Camp David, and there will be a series of dialogues among the ministries and between NSCs and foreign ministries, and of course the summit meeting, annual summit meeting as well. And these are the recommendations of the Dr. Prestup. We can integrate Japan into US-ROK nuclear consultative group, or set up a separate trilateral nuclear consultative group. So that's been discussed a lot in both Korea and Japan, I guess. And I think there is a possibility for that. And also, trilateral should begin to plan for the trilateral cooperation with respect to a Taiwan contingency. That's also the recommendation from Dr. Prestup. And last but not least, it is important to establish a trilateral planning body or a working group to review and de-conflict policy coordination with respect to policy initiatives under the, not the Phnom Penh statement, for today's version, Camp David principles, and what's been discussed during Camp David. That'll be it for my presentation. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 한미일 3자 협력을 한미일 간의 3자 협력, 그리고 또 인도 태평양이라는 그 맥락 하에서의 그 3자의 협력에 대해서 나눠서 이렇게 잘 설명을 해주신 것 같은데요. 우리가 여기서 고민해야 될 부분, 또 질문이 나올 수 있는 부분이 이제 한미일의 3자 협력이 기회와 고려 사항으로 이렇게 설명을 나눠주셨는데, 기회와 관련돼서 또 그 기회가 도전적인 요소로 북중러가 다시 이거를 역이용할 수 있는 그런 상황에 대한 대응 방향, 대응 정책은 어떻게 해야 될 것인지가 또 주요 우리의 도전 과제가 아닐까라는 생각이 들고요. 또 하나는 앞에 그 플래너리 세션에서도 이제 이야기들이 많이 나왔는데, 인태 지역과 관련돼서 주요한 키워드 중에 하나가 바로 연결이라는 부분인 거죠. 커넥션이랑 관련된 부분과 관련돼서 대사님께서도 기조연설에서 일본 대사님께서도 말씀하셨듯이 한미일의 3자 협력 말고도 앞으로 향후 한중일의 또 3자 협력 부분이 이야기됐는데, 이 한미일 3자 협력과 한중일 3자 협력, 각 다양한 3자 소다자 협력이 있을 텐데 여기서의 이런 관계 부분이 어떻게 되는지도 우리가 또 주요하게 고민해 봐야 될 사항이 아닌가라는 생각이 듭니다. 그리고 이어서 리처드 비친거 박사님의 발표 내용을 듣도록 하겠습니다. 부탁드립니다.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I particularly would like to thank KIDA for inviting me back, and particularly Boram and Jusu for asking me to participate in this project. I had a co-author too, Alex Yo, that I wrote my paper with, and unfortunately he was not able to be here today. The issue that I was basically asked to tackle is this whole issue of the future of U.S. ROK Defense Technological Industrial Cooperation, or the shorthand DTIC. So when I use DTIC, you know what I'm talking about. What I was asked to do by Boram is essentially try to consolidate the findings of 3 papers, the one that I co-authored and 2 papers by 2 Korean participants. So I'm going to try and synthesize it all. I'm not saying I did a great job at it. The other authors may feel that I got them wrong or shortchanged them, and I would certainly invite them to interject and feel free to fill in the gaps where they think I might have put them in. But basically, what we were asked to do is to look at this issue of essentially the growth of the ROK defense industry and how it is affected by and it affects collaboration with the U.S. when it comes to defense technology and industrial cooperation. And I think there's two really important findings to make to start off, okay, which may seem obvious, particularly I think to the Korean audience here. The first, of course, is that the ROK has made tremendous strides over the last 50 years in building up an indigenous arms industry, very gradually and in a very evolutionary way, but also in a very determined way. And that this capability for developing and producing arms has resulted in a process of armaments production which is becoming both technologically very complex and able to meet demanding needs. It is done so through hard and deliberate effort as part of a top-down national and I believe social program of self-improvement. It has actively sought, received, and exploited technology from the United States, on the other hand, which has been used in this development process. I think the figure of the United States as an instrumental, germinating source of technology cannot be underemphasized. And as these two countries move forward, I think it is in the interests of both Korea and the United States to improve and increase this process of collaborative arms development and manufacturing. That's sort of the background, the basics. The thing to point out is that the ROK has sought to achieve a high degree of defense technological and industrial capabilities for two reasons. One is to try and realize a strong self-reliant defense capability. And linked to that is the idea of becoming more self-reliant in defense technology and arms manufacturing. There's a very famous saying that supposedly is attributed to the Chinese during the Meiji Restoration, which went, "Rich nation, strong army." I would add a corollary to that. Strong army, strong arms industry. You cannot be a regional great power or indeed a superpower if you have to rely on imported weapon systems. And at the very least, I think Korea recognizes that its ability to serve as a regional power depends heavily on its ability to be able to supply itself with as wide a range of weaponry, from small arms up to submarines and maybe even more, through its own devices. Now, that kind of capability does not come overnight. Again, as I point out, it's a gradual evolutionary process of moving up a ladder of production. And for many years, the ROK did not possess a strong enough defense industrial base, particularly at the level of research and development. And that left it, of course, very reliant on the United States right from the beginning to provide it with the kind of relevant technologies that it needed in order to first be able to produce weapons and then be able to eventually develop its own versions of certain types of weapon systems. During this process, it should be noted that there was very little in the way of a two-way collaboration when we talked about U.S.-Korea defense technology and industrial cooperation. For the most part, it tended to be a one-way transfer of technologies from the United States to the Koreans, but with the idea that the Koreans had of using these imported technologies to promote autarky within its own defense industrial base, and particularly not as a way to expand bilateral armaments collaboration. That was basically the process, I would say, until up to roughly the turn of the century. And if we look at the history of Korean defense industrialization, we see it going through phases of licensed assembly of imported kits to licensed production, where basically it started to make the actual components and subsystems that it then subsequently assembled, and then more and more engaging in types of largely indigenous armaments production, developing such things as the K2 assault rifle, building its own types of destroyers and frigates, even going up to something like the T-50 supersonic jet trainer lead-in fighter. So we see this progress. And in fact, as we've seen, is the results of this improved autarky, the expanded autarky has basically resulted in a couple of trends. One, which I think has been noted by a lot of people, is a rather substantial increase in the export of Korean defense articles. Last year in particular was a boom year for the Koreans, ceiling perhaps up to $17 billion, according to some statistics, exporting a large array of very advanced weapon systems to a large variety of countries. Very successful, which of course reflects well upon the capability and the reliability of the types of weapons that we're talking about. Secondly, Korea has started to become not just a partner in joint arms programs, but a lead partner, or at least an equal partner, in programs, especially those that don't revolve around the United States. In particular, I would point out the KFX program, which it is running with Indonesia, or a program to build a light-armed helicopter with Airbus. I'm going to talk a little bit about that more tomorrow at a different panel, but just to sort of promote bring these things up. These achievements have increasingly put the ROK at times at odds with the United States, because there is a fundamental difference between what the Koreans want from armaments collaboration and what the United States wants. Korea is seeking arms and armaments collaboration, and therefore imported technologies, as a way to expand autarky, a way to increase its self-reliance and to build a defense industry that is more or less what you could call purely Korean. The United States, on the other hand, would prefer to still work in collaborative programs that largely rely on the importation and use of U.S. technologies. And the United States still is reluctant to accept foreign technologies for consideration in a lot of different types of weapons programs, preferring a go-it-alone approach. So all of these things put the U.S. and Korea at a bit of a dilemma as the Korean expertise increases. And what we said here, I actually take it out of one of my colleagues' papers, is that both the ROK and the U.S. say they want to expand defense technology and industrial cooperation, but they don't yet share a common narrative when it comes to what they want out of DTIC. The ROK would still like to have U.S. technology, as well as greater freedom to use that technology and to basically Koreanize or indigenize it. The United States likes the idea of doing collaboration as a alternative to essentially over-relying on other countries that might naturally be increasingly antagonistic, in particular trying to de-risk with China through what they call friend shoring or allied shoring. The other thing is, excuse me, is that there is still a lack of concrete institutional or functional ways in order to expand the process of defense technology and industrial cooperation. These are pointed out by one of my colleagues: the lack of institutions capable of planning and implementing action plans, the lack of a mid to long-term strategy for defense technology and industrial cooperation between the United States and the ROK, too much compartmentalism. that limits such cooperation to key technologies in ad hoc kind of programs, and the lack of consultative mechanisms that are able to cover the whole range of defense science and technology. In particular, I would point out that there is a lot of promise, perhaps, in Korea's advanced commercial technology, which could be of service and use to the United States in trying to, again, ally shore or friend shore, particularly when we come to certain types of high-tech systems such as in electronics and computing. So moving forward, what do we got? We got to find that the U.S. and Korea, we feel, must find more concrete ways to encourage expanded and deepened defense technology industrial cooperation. For these two countries to engage in meaningful cooperation, both sides have to overcome certain built-in hindrances. Seoul must convince the United States that it has unique and advantageous technologies that it can bring to a partnership. At the same time, Washington must be more open to the idea of international cooperation as an effective strategy in terms of cost sharing and risk reducing, and as a means of gaining access to non-U.S. innovations. I'll say that again, as a means of gaining access to non-U.S. innovations, with the idea that we have to abandon a little bit, at least, this tendency to not trust offshore technologies. In addition, concrete cooperation tasks should be laid out. These include a joint strategy for DTIC, the creation of specific action plans that emphasize DTIC as a way to promote joint defense capabilities and needs, and 3, an effort to integrate various cooperative mechanisms. Now, I admit that these are extremely high barriers to collaboration. And again, what is fundamental to this is the fact that both countries approach armaments production from different concepts. Korea is very committed to the idea of essentially achieving self-reliance and global recognition in armaments as much as it does in automobiles, cell phones, and the like. And the United States is essentially trying very hard, or refuses to acknowledge for the most part, the idea that there might be better technologies beyond our shores. These are two extremely difficult types of approaches to overcome and find common ground. That said, we ended on a positive, which is that we feel that the U.S. ROK Security Alliance is now being more and more referred to as a technology and democratic values-based alliance, which holds out promise that DTIC can become, if we're willing to make the effort, a more equally cooperative and advanced type of process. Thank you.
네, 한미동맹 하면은 굉장히 상호 운용성이 중시되고 있고, 또 앞으로 향후 방향과 관련돼서는 통합 억지 부분이 강조가 되고 있는데, 여기서 또 가장 중요한 게 바로 방산 협력 분야인데, 방금 발표를 들으신 바와 같이 실질적인 어떻게 보면 전개, 그러니까 특정 사안 중심으로만 협력이 진행이 되었었지, 포괄적인 측면에서 여러 가지 우리가 달성해야 될 과제가 많다라는 점을 말씀을 해주신 것 같습니다. 지금 뭐 기술 동맹, 또 공급망 협력의 중요성, 이런 것이 강조되고 있는 만큼 앞으로 향후 이 분야와 관련된 한미동맹의 발전 과제가 계속해서 제기되는 그런 분야가 아닌가라는 생각이 듭니다. 이어서 미국 해군 참모대학의 트란스 로릭 교수님이 해양 안보와 관련돼서 발표를 해주시겠습니다. 부탁드립니다.
Let me begin by echoing the thank you to KIDA and for all the folks here who have made this conference possible. It's really well done, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation and to both organizations for the invitation to be part of this great project. My co-conspirator, if you will, is Dr. Kim Ki-ju, who is in the audience here, and we aligned a lot on our thinking in regards to the papers, and so I'm not going to make a whole lot of specific distinctions. But I also want to say that in addition to being Dr. Kim Ki-ju, he is Captain Kim Ki-ju of the ROK Navy, but recently retired. And so congratulations on your many years of service to the South Korean Navy. So as we looked at maritime security from the two sides, it's very clear that the U.S.-South Korea alliance, that South Korean security began focused on the ground fight. And of course, as the years have evolved, add to that now the nuclear weapons and ballistic missile challenge that is part of that. But increasingly, we both saw that the maritime domain has a growing number of security challenges, not only around the Korean Peninsula, but also in regional waters and in global waters. And as well, of course, the story of South Korea's economic development is an amazing story to the point of its economic prowess at this particular point in time. And that brings with it a lot of interest in a secure, stable maritime domain for the acquisition of resources as well as for the international trade that is part of South Korean prosperity. And so consequently, when we look at all of these issues, we both came to the conclusion that it's time for the alliance to become more of a maritime alliance. And how can the United States and South Korea work together on some of these common maritime issues to be able to have a greater role in the alliance to address some of these common issues. But I think also important is we looked at maritime security in a very broad way. We hear maritime security and we often think of Navy-to-Navy kinds of issues, perhaps Coast Guard issues, but we also looked at it as a much broader sense of security in the notion of non-traditional human security types of issues, such as illegal fishing, pollution, the impacts of climate change, and the broad maintenance of a stable maritime ecosystem. All of those elements are important maritime security interests that are not only important for the United States and South Korea, but also for the world. And so I think important areas that, again, point to the importance of focusing on maritime security for the alliance. And so at this turning point here of 70 years of the alliance, we thought this was an important time to look at where the alliance can try to address some of these more maritime security issues. And in fact, when you look at a number of the different summit meetings that have happened over the last number of months, you see certainly at the front end of those agreements and statements, traditional kinds of security concerns. But if you continue reading on, it talks a lot about research and development and cooperation on technology and science issues, on climate change. Those things all resonate very well within a maritime domain, and again point to why this alliance cooperation in maritime security can be and should be even broader than just sort of traditional elements like that. So with that thinking as our backdrop, we ended up focusing on three key sets of areas where there could be increased maritime cooperation: Navy, Coast Guard, and then civilian institutions. So let me begin first with Navy-to-Navy cooperation. Of course, that's still going to be a part of increased alliance maritime cooperation. And here we see room for anti-submarine warfare cooperation that can be increased, ballistic missile defense cooperation, which is part of the regional and growing concern for North Korea's ballistic missile capability. Also, I think as the likelihood of North Korea ever giving up its nuclear weapons has probably been long gone, the issue of North Korea as a proliferation threat becomes increasingly more important. And so the navies can work to try to re-energize the Proliferation Security Initiative, to try to make sure that whatever North Korea develops stays in North Korea. And so increasing this exercise platform, if you will, for the navies, increases interoperability, communication, information sharing between the two fleets, and that this kind of cooperation helps to create a common framework for both navies to be able to cooperate better in whatever the maritime domain calls for in that particular notion. In addition, another sort of idea that is definitely far-reaching and perhaps pushing the envelope a bit is that the United States could seek to have its naval vessels do a more frequent rotation and port visits to South Korean ports. Also, perhaps, if the security environment dictates such, that the United States could have these rotations be for a longer duration, and perhaps even home porting a ship or two or a submarine or two in a South Korean port. These kinds of gestures would help to demonstrate the U.S. commitment to South Korean security, help to, again, increase interoperability, and lastly, provide an important deterrence signal for the alliance in this maritime domain. We also think that there is an opportunity for the alliance and increasing cooperation to be a platform or a catalyst for broader regional maritime cooperation. Of course, you are already seeing this in regards to enhanced South Korea, U.S., Japan trilateral cooperation, but this could also be increased to other states who wish to participate in some of these kinds of efforts to increase maritime security. Australia, Japan, India, ASEAN states, the European Union, etc. And it could also be done in the context of the Quad, because the Quad, one of their working groups is maritime domain awareness. There's a good possibility for the alliance to be an active participant to a greater degree and be a catalyst, if you will, for more work in that Quad working group. Shifting to the Coast Guard, we think that there's some potential for the two Coast Guards to possibly work together and share in increasing maritime security. Both the U.S. and the South Korean Coast Guards have tremendous experience, tremendous expertise. Working together perhaps through personnel exchanges, possibly joint training and exercises, could be another path for collaboration between these two maritime forces. The U.S. Coast Guard could send a cutter to the West Sea to be able to work and exercise with the South Korean Coast Guard as a way, again, of having that tangible sort of commitment of maritime cooperation, and do so perhaps on a rotational basis. But also, again, I think that there is room for the alliance, as it improves that cooperation, to also be a catalyst for broader regional cooperation. And through the alliance, go to other countries in the region that might benefit from increased cooperation, and have the United States and South Korean Coast Guards work together with perhaps the Coast Guards of the South Pacific Island states, of some of the Southeast Asian states, to be able to work to help these countries better improve their ability to protect their own exclusive economic zones and protect their fishing resources from challenges to that very valuable resource. And again, that's important not only for those regional states, but the broader sustainability of maritime security environments. Let me then shift, since I'm getting close to being out of time here, to the civilian side of this. And this is where I think we really saw an opportunity for a broad look at what maritime security is. In short, a sustainable maritime ecosystem is an important interest for everyone on the planet. And if the alliance can try to shift in ways to work to to address some of those challenges, that would be an important contribution. But this time not with the navies or the Coast Guard, but can the two countries try to encourage greater cooperation between civilian institutions, universities, research institutions that can help to study and come up with solutions to some of the issues that are coming from climate change, from pollution, from fishing issues, and again, the broader sustainability of the maritime security environment, that there's a role to play for civilian institutions that could be done with relatively modest amounts of funding. It would not necessarily be anything that would be a problem from a threatening sort of posture, but yet could do an awful lot to address a problem, set of problems for the maritime security environment that is crucial to all individuals. And so again, let me just wrap up by saying, at this time in the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, an alliance that has been very focused on a certain set of issues, I think it's very important to think beyond that set and look at the maritime environment, because there is an increasing level and number of challenges in that area that alliance cooperation can help to address in some way. So let me stop there. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 요즘 해양안보 관련돼서 굉장히 요즘에 핫 이슈가 되고 있고, 또 인태 전략이 나오면서 각 국가들의 또 해양안보 부분이 강조가 되고 있지 않나라는 생각이 듭니다. 앞선 세션에서도 유럽 같은 경우에도 유럽 시각에서도 인도 태평양 지역과 유럽 지역에서의 그런 협력 부분과 관련돼서도 잠수함과 관련된 협력을 제시했듯이, 앞으로 이 해양 협력과 관련돼서 굉장히 더 많은 과제들이 도출이 되지 않을까라는 생각이 드는데요. 또 하나 몇 가지 그 도전 과제를 말씀을 드리자면, 해양 협력과 관련돼서 굉장히 광의의 개념으로 정의가 되면서 많은 행위자들이 해양 협력 부분에 동참을 시킬 수가 있지만, 또 하나의 그 딜레마 중에 하나는 광의의 협력이 협력의 심화와 발전 부분에 또 저해하는 요소로도 작용이 되지 않나라는 생각이 듭니다. 그런 측면에서 해양 협력의 발전 부분을 보다 심화시키기 위한, 어떻게 보면 전통적 안보와 관련된 부분에서의 방법이 뭔지에 대한 그런 고민도 필요하지 않을까라는 생각이 들고요. 또 하나의 과제는, 우리가 해양 안보, 해양 협력 하면 주로 해양 국가들 중심으로 전개가 되어 왔던 것이, 이제는 어떻게 보면 대륙 국가들 간의 해양 협력 부분이 제기가 되고 있다라는 거죠. 이미 중국과 러시아의 그 해양 공동 훈련이라든지 해양 협력에 이제는 또 북한까지 이런 분야에 조인을 하지 않을까에 대한 이런 우려가 제기가 되고 있기 때문에 해양 협력과 관련돼서 앞으로 향후에 우리가 받을 수 있는 그러한 도전 과제, 그리고 그러한 도전 과제에 대한 협력 분야를 어떻게 발전시켜 나가야 될 것인지가 우리의 주요 앞으로의 과제가 되지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 그리고 헤리티지와의 그런 공동 연구 부분에서 이제 마지막이 되는데요. 클린트 윅 미국 한국경제연구소의 클린트 박사님께서는 연합방위 태세 강화를 한미 간에 어떻게 해야 되는지에 대한 부분에 대해서 발표를 해주시도록 하겠습니다. 예, 부탁드립니다.
Thank you, Director Lee. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, my first thank you to KIDA and to Heritage as well for organizing this fantastic, our particular project, but also HDF as a whole. My first interaction with KIDA was when I was still toiling in obscurity as a graduate student, and sent an email seeking a hard copy of a report on Roh Moo-hyun's cooperative self-reliant defense policy, and it showed up within 3 days of my request. So I've always looked favorably upon KIDA and their fantastic research and analysts since then. This is my first time back on the Korean Peninsula since 3.5 years ago, so I'm very grateful to be here, and I spent half the last decade living and working in Korea, so it's a bit like coming home. As was mentioned, my counterpart and I, BUNN, we focused on the combined defense posture of the alliance, specifically combined exercises and changes to the combined command architecture. it was wonderful working with B because our papers are really complementary to one another and we're in agreement on a lot of points. And so I'm going to focus in particular on 3 areas where we agreed, which is on preparing for a post-nuclear use environment, certain aspects of the conditions-based OPCON transition plan, or COTP, and third, clarifying or demystifying the relationship between the United Nations Command, or UNC, and the CFC, both presently but also thinking forward to a potential post-transition environment. And then I'm going to highlight 2 areas that don't necessarily clash with B's paper, but do that I emphasized more, and they're more on the U.S. side, U.S. perspective, which is the need to gain greater clarity about and link up the fledgling ROC Strategic Command with the Combined Forces Command and use exercises to do so. And lastly, discuss a little bit about enhancing consultation on on a simultaneous conflict scenario, which has been mentioned. So to begin with, a post-nuclear use exercises and training. The alliance is already, in the context of the DSC, the Deterrence Strategy Committee, running TTXs on nuclear use scenarios. But beyond that strategic level sort of exercising, B and I agreed that the alliance should work to incorporate post-nuclear use scenarios and how to operate in post-nuclear use environments into military exercises, incorporating elements of force protection, civilian sheltering, survival techniques. Again, maybe to Bruce's earlier point, for ROC and U.S. sides to better understand one another's positions and understandings on what this would actually look like in God forbid, the horrific event. Another piece of it, more broadly, is this might provide a clear picture of the reality of nuclear war, its immense humanitarian effects, and immense and profound moral implications, and maybe reinforce greater need for nuclear responsibility and security, vice just nuclear deterrence and blandishments. Moving to the second topic, the conditions-based OPCON transition plan, or COTP. So the first 2 conditions are rather concrete, and they involve South Korea acquiring certain critical capabilities to address North Korea's advancing nuclear missile threat, but also demonstrating the C2, the command and control capabilities, to lead the alliance's combined defense against these threats. It's my understanding that they are still quite some way from meeting these conditions. The FOC second stage has been assessed, but has not been certified. That's not going to happen this calendar year, from my understanding. I'm not sure what will happen next year. But I think we're some ways off from this. What I highlighted, what B and I highlighted, was the third condition of the COP plan, which is rather nebulous, and I think deliberately created as such, which is that the security environment on and around the Korean Peninsula needs to be conducive to OPCON transfer. So that's a political construction, which is my understanding, it was made that way in order to indefinitely delay this transition. This is problematic from my perspective. I think the alliance needs to be clearer about the indefinite delay that this will likely impose, and the risks that that leads to, and also contemplate dropping this third condition and navigating and adjudicating the risks that will come with the transition, because I worry, having traced this interminable OPCON transition policy and debate from a combined concept to a parallel concept back to a combined concept, this really does undermine the day-to-day communication between the different theater level commands. So I think getting greater clarity and pushing this forward and really thinking hard about this third condition is critical for the alliance. However, assuming COTP does move forward, I think one way to rethink moving from the current CFC to a future CFC, which is, again, the same binational bilateral structure, just led by a ROC 4-star, would be to institute a rotational command process, where the commander switches back and forth on a 2 to 3 year basis between US and ROC commanders, either as a transitional phase or as the way it's going to go moving forward. So it's not really so much OPCON transition as it is OPCON sharing. I think this is important for several reasons. One, it will acclimatize ROC commanders to the so-called second chain of command on the American side, which they're going to need to be more and more conversant with as they expand their strategic aperture if they're going to take control, operational control. But it also acclimatizes the U.S. side to the capabilities and thinkings of ROC generals. I think it's also important because it's often discussed in terms of sovereignty here in South Korea, but that goes both ways. And when you listen to people on Capitol Hill who don't understand OPCON transition really at all, talk about this, the optics of it is we're now deputy to a ROC commander. And even if it's the same binational structure, even if it's the same military committee, security consultative mechanisms, the optics of it are it's in effect a violation of the Pershing Rule, even though it's not. And it increases the chances of maybe reducing, in some ways, the U.S. commitment, maybe moving from a 4-star to a 3-star. And the alliance needs to think through the spillover effects of how this might play out moving forward. And I think a rotational setup might help mitigate that. Clarifying the UNC-CFC relationship. The UN sending states, I think the alliance really needs to try to further operationalize their involvement with the CFC, and that is actively happening. And I've been writing about and promoting the idea that the ROC really itself needs to take greater agency of the UNC and enhance its role therein, increasing staffing, its cooperation with the different UN sending states. But also, the UNC as a multilateral organization provides a ready platform to deepen bilateral cooperation with Japan, where UNC rear headquarters is stationed, a trilateral cooperation within a multilateral context. I think it's a very helpful mechanism to do this. Some of the discussion earlier talked about how the European partners can show greater fidelity to the Indo-Pacific. They already are in the UNC on the peninsula. And so I think it's important to note how that can enhance deterrence through multilateral cooperation rather than nuclear blandishments, again. But it's also important to note that there has been important progress in this regard over the last 10, 15 years. Various UN sending states really have increased the size of their liaison groups and engagement. Obviously, President Yoon of late has been quite outspoken in his support for UNC modernization and embracing the UNC. I think there are different motivations for that. But and third, I'll say, just in last year's Old Chief Freedom Shield exercises, the USFK unilaterally announced the UN sending states' participation. In last month's UFC, it was a combined message. So that right there indicates this is already evolving and there's already an embrace of this. So I like to see that. Now, the two areas that I mentioned where I stressed a little more in my paper and B did not so much in hers, ROC Stratcom. Obviously, it doesn't exist yet, so what am I talking about? Washington pushed very hard to include mention of ROC Stratcom in the Washington Declaration. And to get President Yoon to commit in the declaration, paraphrasing here, to link up or to connect up ROC Stratcom with the Combined Forces Command. And time will tell how that plays out, but from my conversations with folks, including yesterday, the U.S. side really lacks clarity on what's being invested in, what's going to be operational and when it will be stood up, how this thing's actually going to operate, and whether or not it's going to be sort of autonomously operated or part of the CFC. And this is, of course, of concern because the nature of ROC Stratcom and the 3K defense system is potentially quite escalatory quite quickly. Sort of the apogee of crisis where we've moved from general deterrence to an immediate deterrent situation. So it's not new for the U.S. to be concerned about escalatory risks. The difference today is the security environment's much more complex, North Korea's capabilities are much more robust, and South Korea's ability to hedge and be more autonomous is greater than it's ever been. So I would argue this requires the alliance to redouble efforts to really communicate transparently about this. Lastly, and I'm probably going over time, is simultaneous conflict. So the strategic flexibility of USFK is not a new topic. There were intense debates about this in the aughts, the mid-aughts. But it's reemerged lately with U.S. officials speaking about this more openly, including General LaCamera. And anytime these comments are made, of course, they're picked up and amplified here in Korea, understandably so. And there's great concern about what this might mean. But I would also highlight, starting with the Moon administration, but really increasing under President Yoon, South Korea's notable shift in strategic signaling regarding Taiwan. And this started with reiterating the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait in the Moon-Biden joint statement in May of 2021. Same expression in the joint statement of May of 2022, but adding the importance of that to regional peace and stability, so expanding the scope of the issue. And then in the Phnom Penh statement, quite remarkably, further expanding the importance of the issue to the international community, so making it a global issue. And I think most notably in South Korea's own Indo-Pacific strategy document, linking the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait directly to the Korean Peninsula's own peace and stability. To my understanding and tracing, that's the first ever direct linkage like that I've seen from the South Korean government. But top-level strategic signaling is one thing, rhetoric is one thing, actual operational military political preparedness is another. And this is a very sensitive topic, I understand that. But I think the alliance needs to think harder about what a simultaneous conflict scenario would look like, because, as has already been mentioned, what happens with Taiwan is directly linked to the Korean Peninsula. And the concept of strategic flexibility itself, and I'll close with this, I think is often unhelpful because it's framed in crisis connotations, specifically in terms of a regional contingency and the flowing of US forces off the peninsula. But a more multifaceted definition includes not just the flow of US forces from the peninsula, but also to the peninsula. And so maybe just building a little bit on what Terry was saying, I think there are ways to sort of more broadly define strategic flexibility, not to be crisis-oriented, but in peacetime, to involve the greater movement and cooperation between US and ROC forces, maritime and otherwise, but also multilateral partners. I think this has a deterrent signaling effect all its own, and of course, hopefully will prevent ever having to, God forbid, encounter such a simultaneous conflict scenario. I've probably gone way over, so I'll stop with that.
네, 감사합니다. 연합방위 태세 강화 관련돼서 이제 한미 연합 군사 훈련 확대 부분 또 연합 지휘 체계를 어떻게 공고히 가져가야 될 부분인가를 이제 잘 말씀을 해주셨는데요. 이거 관련돼서는 다음 세션인 박찬우 센터장님이 주재하는 위협 환경의 변화와 각국의 대응과 관련돼서 그쪽 분야에서 보다 심도 있게 발전된 논의가 전개되지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 여기에서 한국이나 미국이나 모두 연합훈련과 관련돼서 보면은 인태사에서도 미국의 전략사령부와의 그러한 연계되는 연습, 또 앞으로 우리가 한미 연합훈련을 했을 때 향후 한국에서 만들어지는 한국 전략사령부가 연합사와 또 연계해서 하는 연합훈련, 이 부분이 사실상 굉장히 약한 연결고리라고 볼 수가 있습니다. 그래서 앞으로 말씀해 주신 그 분야와 관련돼서도 한 측뿐만 아니라 미측도 이 전략사령부가 향후 연합훈련을 하는 데 있어서 어떻게 역할을 분담하고 그 공동 발전시켜 나갈 수 있는지에 대한 그 부분을 발전시키는 게 중요하지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 특히 워싱턴 선언 이후에 또 NCG가 만들어지고 또 그 안에서 재래식과 핵, 통합, 전력 부분이 관련된 부분이 논의가 되고 있는 만큼 이 전략사령부의 연습이 전략사령부가 연합훈련에 들어오는 연습이 매우 중요한 그런 국면이 되지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 이로써 일단 첫 번째 카이다와 미국의 그 공동 연구를 한 첫 번째 그 프로젝트에 대한 발표를 끝냈고요. 근데 두 번째는 이번에 그 헤리티지에서 클리너 박사님께서 말씀해 주신 확장억지의 발표 부분에서도 들으셨겠지만 이 확장억지와 아무리 위협이 고도화되고 발전되고 확장억지를 많이 해준다 할지라도 결국에는 동맹국이 받는 그러한 안전 보장에 대한 문제는 계속 여전히 의구심이 발생을 하게 되는 거죠. 그래서 이 분야와 관련돼서 어떻게 이 문제를 해결해 나갈 것인가가 또 하나의 또 카이다와 카네기 재단에서 같이 공동 연구한 분야입니다. 먼저 영상, 지난주에 이거와 관련돼서 저희가 TTX를 했었는데요. 여기에 참여했던 플레이어 분들께서 세 분이 동영상으로 그 관련된 내용을 짤막하게 말씀을 해주시고요. 그리고 이어서 최수원 박사님이 전반적으로 그 공동 연구의 주요 내용에 대해서 몇 가지를 말씀을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 동영상 부탁드릴게요.
네, 안녕하세요. My name is Toby Dalton from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm pleased to be joining you by video, although I'm very sorry I'm not able to join the Hongneung Forum in person. My best wishes for a successful conference. I want to speak briefly about building assurance, and specifically nuclear assurance in the ROK-US alliance, and some ideas for how the research community can work on this challenging topic. South Korea and the United States have been working for over a decade to improve their coordination and capability on deterrence. This is responsive to changes in the threat from North Korea and a shared desire in both capitals to further build alliance capacity for deterrence and response. The Washington Declaration recorded some of these developments, including a very notable commitment from President Biden to President Yoon that the US president would consult with the South Korean president in a situation in which the United States might consider options for nuclear use on the Korean Peninsula. Now, shared belief in the efficacy of deterrence is a necessary condition for assurance within the alliance, but it is not a sufficient condition. Assurance is inherently a more political activity. It is a process of continual renewal of shared ideas and trust among South Korean and US officials that each side will act in the mutual interests of the alliance and that their publics can be confident in their capabilities and intentions to follow through on their commitments. Improving assurance requires careful, nuanced, and frank dialogue to understand each other's concerns, to identify where there may be misalignment in expectations, and to develop together ideas for actions that can demonstrate to our publics the durability and resolve of our commitment, and to signal to North Korea that any nuclear threat will be countered, that any nuclear use will inevitably result in the end of the Kim regime, as our declaratory policy indicates. For many years, South Korean officials and experts have expressed frustration at the inability of formal deterrence dialogues to overcome some of the structural constraints to developing such shared ideas, namely the challenges the US government faces in sharing highly classified information about its nuclear plans and decision-making processes. Those frustrations are heard and understood in Washington, which is why there is now the Nuclear Consultative Group, an outcome of the Washington Declaration. But non-governmental experts, including former officials, can help their governments by complementing formal dialogues with informal exchanges that elicit and sharpen where there are different views. One means of such exchange is to use tabletop exercises and scenarios to illuminate the issues that need the most urgent work. Conducting TTXs for the purpose of assurance is a departure from their typical use for wargaming tactics, but if done correctly, we find that it can be an effective and creative way to pursue the objective of better understanding each other and developing novel policy recommendations for the governments to consider implementing in their formal processes. Working on assurance through a TTX has implications for scenario design, questions that the players should consider, and the structure of the game. This is a rich area of potential research and cooperation for institutions like KIDA, and I hope that American and Korean experts can continue to collaborate in this important project, sustaining assurance and effective deterrence. Thank you very much.
안녕하세요 to all of you at KIDA's conference. I'm Elaine BUNN. I spent 40 years in the U.S. government, and for the last 4 years of the Obama administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, I co-chaired the ROC-U.S. consultations on deterrence. I've worked with experts from KIDA many times. I have found those at KIDA to have deep expertise in important areas, including on defense strategy and extended nuclear deterrence. That continuity of knowledge is important, especially as administrations and personnel change in your government and in mine. Let me say a few words about the evolution of alliance consultations as threats and capabilities evolve. Even though we've been treaty allies for 70 years, formal consultations specifically on nuclear deterrence began only in 2010 with the Extended Deterrence Policy Committee, the EDPC. The group was renamed as the Deterrence Strategy Committee in 2015 when it merged with the Counter-Missile Capabilities Committee. The group's work led to a tailored deterrence strategy document agreed to by defense ministers in 2013, as well as the 4D strategy to detect, disrupt, defend, and destroy. Since 2010, there have been dozens of multi-day, in-depth bilateral discussions on deterrence with South Korean officials in this group. These meetings have typically included assessments of the evolving North Korean nuclear threat, updates by each country on policy, strategy, and forces, visits to U.S. nuclear forces, including ICBM launches, going on SSBNs, climbing into bombers, visiting nuclear laboratories and U.S. Strategic Command. And it's included tabletop exercises, dozens over the past 13 years. We've explored a variety of scenarios and what the key factors and considerations would be for both countries' leaders and their advisors in dealing with such scenarios. These tabletop exercises allow South Korean and U.S. civilian and military officials to think through a number of different feasible scenarios and options involving nuclear crises, to understand differing perspectives and priorities, and to sort them out among allies in peacetime rather than in the midst of a crisis. In 2016, after the fifth DPRK nuclear test, the United States and South Korea added another group, the High-Level State and Defense Extended Deterrence Consultative and Strategy Committee, or EDSCG, which met in 2016, in 2019, and in 2022. And of course, in April, our presidents agreed in the Washington summit on a higher level forum, the Nuclear Consultative Group, which met for the first time in July. In my view, the most significant item in the Washington Declaration is the U.S. president's commitment to make every effort to consult with the ROK on any possible nuclear weapons employment on the Korean Peninsula. The other items in the Washington Declaration, such as the NCG, the coordination between militaries, further tabletop exercises, are necessary implementation steps for that fundamental commitment. Continuous dialogue among our political and military officials and among former officials and experts outside government is key to an effective alliance and keeping ahead of evolving threats. In conclusion, let me say, the threat may change, capabilities evolve, and the names and the levels of consultative groups may change, but the U.S. commitment to ROC security, a commitment underpinned by approximately 30,000 U.S. troops in South Korea, as well as by our nuclear forces wherever they are, whether in the United States or silently underwater but always in the region, or more visibly seen in South Korea. That commitment to ROC security is constant and enduring. 감사합니다 and 같이 갑시다.
예, 저는 어제와 오늘 이틀에 걸쳐서 우리 국방연구원과 미국의 카네기 재단 그리고 미국 과학자 협회가 주관하는 북핵 관련 확장 억제와 그리고 동맹 보장을 위한 그 회의에 참여를 했습니다. 우리가 잘 알듯이 지난 그 한미 정상 간의 워싱턴 선언을 통해서 우리는 북핵에 대해서 더욱 잘 대응할 수 있게 되고 또 동맹이 견고함을 다시 한번 확인할 수 있었습니다. 이에 따라서 북핵에 대해서 보다 더 효과적으로 대응하고 결정적이며 빈틈없이 대응하기 위한 그러한 방안을 논의하기 시작했습니다. 지난 그 NCG 출범 회의도 말하자면 그 일환이라고 볼 수 있죠. 워싱턴 선언에 따라서 또 NCG에 따라서 미국의 핵 전략과 관련해서 우리의 참여 기회도 더 높아지고 있습니다. 핵 기획 단계에서부터도 참여할 수 있고 또 핵 관련 의사결정 과정에도 어느 정도 참여할 수 있는 그러한 기회의 폭이 더 넓어진 것으로 볼 수 있습니다. 물론 아직도 많은 부족함이 있습니다. 그리고 또 실제로 미국이 정말 우리를 위해서 핵을 사용해 줄 것인가 하는 것에 대한 의구심도 있는 것이 사실입니다. 그러나 이러한 그 우려를 해소하기 위한 그러한 많은 노력이 진행되고 있고 어제 오늘 저희들이 참여한 회의도 그러한 노력의 일환이라고 볼 수 있습니다. 어제 오늘 회의에는 그 미국과 한국의 주로 군과 외교 쪽에 근무했던 전직 그 고위급 관료들이 참여해서 아주 솔직하게 의견을 교환했습니다. 이것은 매우 큰 의미가 있습니다. 이 얘기를 해보니까 어떤 경우에는 인식의 차이도 있습니다. 그러나 대화를 통해서 그러한 인식의 차이를 좁혀가고 공동의 이해를 더 넓혀가는 그러한 효과가 있었습니다. 우리는 대화를 통해서 북한의 핵을 어떻게 억제할 것인가, 그리고 또 북한이 만일 핵을 사용한다면 이에 어떻게 대응할 것인가 하는 것을 논의했습니다. 북한이 핵을 사용한다면 분명하게 북한의 정권은 종말을 고하게 될 것이다라고 하는 그런 공동의 인식을 한미 간에 가질 수 있었고 이거 매우 그런 의미에서 뜻깊은 논의를 하였습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 세 분의 동영상을 통해서 대충 TTX 지난주에 있었던 TTX에서 어떤 내용이 진행이 됐을 거라는 것을 여러분들이 유추하셨으리라고 예상이 됩니다. 여기에 대해서 최수원 박사님이 마지막으로 좀 마무리 말씀 부탁드릴게요.
Hello, my name is Suwon Choi for Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. I'm sure that the 3 videos you just watched here given you a good sense of the overall outcome of the Alliance Assurance TTX, which was co-hosted by KIDA and the Carnegie Foundation. Since the meeting was held as a closed session and included policymakers from both countries, I'm limited in my ability to go into the details of the meeting, but I would like to focus on the background, goals, and outcomes of the TTX. The Alliance Assurance TTX took place over 2 days last week in Washington, D.C. The idea for the Alliance Assurance TTX began when the United States proposed a joint research to the ROK in order to increase the South Korean public's credibility in extended deterrence in the face of the North Korea's escalating nuclear threat. Against this backdrop, the TTX accomplished 3 goals. First, to understand the differences in perceptions of the North Korean nuclear threat, extended deterrence, and assurance between the United States and ROK, and to lay the foundation for mutual trust. Second, to discuss how to effectively communicate the United States' commitment to alliance in the event of a North Korean nuclear threat or use. And third, to focus on difficult issues that are rarely discussed formally at the government level. The TTX centered on a scenario consisting of Move 1 and Move 2, with Move 1 focusing on how to deter North Korea's use of nuclear weapons, and Move 2 focusing on how to respond to North Korea's use of nuclear weapons. In each move, there were heated discussions between the two countries centered on 4 main points. First, we examined what the adversary is trying to achieve by assessing North Korea's nuclear threats and intentions to use nuclear weapons. Second, we examined what the alliance is ultimately trying to achieve by sharing the ultimate goals of the two countries. And third, we laid the groundwork for understanding each other's positions by identifying what the alliance is expected to demand of the other country. Specifically, we spent time identifying the effectiveness and risks of nuclear or conventional weapons. On the last day, we discussed various policy recommendations that we had identified through the scenario unfolding. These policy recommendations will be reflected in the future development of the NCG, communicated externally at a publicly available level, and will be useful in exploring ways to advance KIDA's joint research with the United States next year. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 지금 한 1시간 35분 정도 시간이 지났는데요. 놀랍게도 여러분들 점심 식사 이후의 세션임에도 불구하고 조시는 분이 한 분도 없어요. 정말 흥미로운 세션이 아니었나라는 생각이 듭니다. 지금 저희가 한 25분 정도 시간이 남아 있는데요. 플로어에서 여러분들 굉장히 다양한 주제로 그 많은 이야기들이 발표가 되어졌고, 또 제가 그 분이 발표를 할 때마다 몇 가지 계속해서 발표자분들에게 문제 제기를 하기도 했습니다. 그래서 종합해서 한 25분 정도 여러분들의 질문과 응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 질문 있으신 분들은 손을 먼저 들어주시고, 그리고 소속을 밝혀주시고 질문을 해주시길 바랍니다. 네, 질문. 네, 저기.
네, 감사합니다. 저는 합동참모본부 차장으로 전역한 예비역육군 중장 윤의철이라고 합니다. 지금은 카이다에서 카이다 안보센터에서 개건연구원으로 있습니다. 누가 통역 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
동시 통역되고 있어요. 동시 통역되고 있습니다. 걱정 안 하셔도 돼요.
저는 두 가지 질문을 드리고자 합니다. 첫 번째는 지금 북한 핵과 관련돼 가지고서는 한미 동맹 그리고 동맹 보장이 과연 실효성을 앞으로도 계속 가질 것이냐 하는 문제고, 두 번째는 인도 태평양 지역에서의 전쟁에서 작전적 통합 운영에 관한 문제, 이 두 가지를 질문드리고자 합니다. 먼저 첫 번째입니다. 오늘 김정은하고 푸틴이 만났습니다. 만나서 북한의 우주 위성 기술을 제공하기로 이렇게 협의를 했습니다. 이것은 무엇을 의미하냐면은 북한의 핵 공격 기술이 대단히 고도화되고 핵 지휘 통제 능력도 고도화된다는 것을 의미를 합니다. 또한 중국과 러시아는 앞으로도 유엔의 안보리 제재와 관계없이 지속적으로 북한을 다양한 방면에서 지원할 거라고 생각합니다. 세 번째는 중국의 문제입니다. 중국은 핵무기를 더 많이 개발하면서 주변을 핵무기로 위협할 거라고 생각하고 있습니다. 왜냐하면은 얼마 전 한국의 TV 프로그램에서 중국의 공산당 학자를 만났는데, 이 사람은 서슴없이 중국의 핵무기로 한국을 없애버릴 거라는 그런 위협을 서슴없이 말한 적이 있습니다. 이러한 것으로 봤을 때 현재 우리 한미가 하고 있는 NCG가 북한의 고도화되는 핵 여기에 충분히 대응할 수 있는가 하는 문제하고, 두 번째는 북한의 핵 위협뿐만이 아니라 중국의 핵 위협, 주변국에 대한 위협, 한반도라든지 일본에 대한 핵 위협, 이런 부분에 대해서는 어떻게 더 효과적으로 해나갈 수 있는가, 이런 방안이 찾아져야 된다고 생각하는데 여기에 대한 의견을 하나 묻고 두 번째는 우크라이나와 러시아 전쟁에서 무기 체계의 상호 운용성과 상호 호환성이 굉장히 중요해지고 있습니다. 나토에서 지원하는 여러 가지 무기나 탄약 이런 부분들이 실제 우크라이나군이 바로 사용하기에 굉장히 제한됐기 때문에 여기에 대한 교육 훈련이라든지 여러 가지 문제에서 이 문제점을 야기한 바가 있습니다. 따라서 차제 인도 태평양 지역에서는 이러한 문제점을 해결하기 위해서 무기 체계라든지 탄약 이런 부분에 대해서 표준화와 그다음에 상호 운용성, 상호 호환성을 증진시켜 가지고서는 어떠한 위협에도 상호 협조돼 가지고서는 대응할 수 있는 이러한 능력들을 작전적 능력을 작전적 통합 능력을 길러야 된다고 생각하는데 여기에 대한 의견을 말씀해 주시면 좋겠습니다. 예, 이상입니다.
네, 감사합니다. 여기 저스틴 앤더슨 질문 받고 그리고 두 분 질문 받고 그리고 답변을 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lee. Briefly, I have a question for each of the two studies. So for Boram and for Bruce, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your recommendation to operationalize the nuclear consultative group. What exactly is meant by that recommendation? I'd be interested to hear you expand on that. And then for Dr. Choi, who I think is the only person here in person, since everyone else is on video. I appreciate the fact you mentioned that because of the participation of former policymakers, quite a few of the discussions during the tabletop exercise must remain confidential. But I wonder if, because you highlighted it, that there were some areas of heated discussion, if without saying how people stated their particular views, if you could perhaps mention what some of those issues were that generated such heat, and I hope also some light during the TTX last week. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 저스틴은 질문자를 지정을 했기 때문에 지정 받으신 분이 답변을 해주시면 좋을 것 같고요. 그다음에 윤희철 장군님께서 질문을 해주신 부분과 관련돼서는 일단 브루스 클리너가 답변을 해주시고, 그다음에 작전적 운용 측면과 관련돼서는 리처드 비친거 교수님께서 아무래도 방산 쪽과 관련된 좀 그 전문성이 있으시니까 그와 관련돼서 말씀을 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 네, 먼저 답변을 클리너 그리고 비친거, 곰보람, 최수원 순서로 답변 부탁드릴게요.
Thank you very much. Both very good questions, and by that I mean very difficult. If I could address Justin first, the nuclear consultative group right now, it's on paper, and so it's a pledge by both countries to make more explicit their views, their desires, their requirements, and in many ways it's would seem to be the most burden is on the U.S. That said, the U.S. also is seeking South Korea to define what it wants. U.S. officials have complained that Korea says they want more, but then they can't define what it is. U.S. officials will also point out that initially a lot of the work by the nuclear consultative group will be nuclear education. And they emphasize they're not being condescending, but that because Korea has not had exposure to the strategy, the tactics, the plans, that a lot of it will be, educating the Korean officials on sort of how the U.S. thinks of nuclear strategy. It will also be kind of overcoming what, again, the U.S. might see as a tendency by Korean advocates on over-reliance on nuclear weapons. Some non-government but outside advocates, including retired senior officers, might argue that it if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, no matter how small, no matter how few casualties, the U.S. must respond with nuclear weapons. Some retired generals have said even if a tactical nuclear weapon takes out a tank battalion, the U.S. needs to annihilate Pyongyang. That's a war crime. And the U.S. would say that's not how we would respond. We don't necessarily respond with a nuclear weapon to a nuclear weapon. We have missions that we're trying to achieve. So a lot of it will be kind of educating each other on what the thoughts are. And by going through the tabletop exercises, it's also it's designed to draw out how each country would respond and to try to sort of bridge any kind of gap. So the U.S. will be trying to explain how its strategy is, how it would use nuclear weapons. It's going to be difficult in the sense of just as the existing Operation Plan 5015, or if it's been redesignated, is a series of decision points. If North Korea comes down the West Coast, CFC will respond in one way. If they come down both coasts, we'll respond in a different way. Similarly, with nuclear weapons, it will depend on the circumstances and the situation. So there's going to be a lot of explanation and then drawing it out. Korea may have perceptions or expectations of how involved it is in U.S. nuclear decision-making. President Yoon has said some things after the April summit that made it sound like it would almost be a dual-key operation. That is not going to be the case. It will remain a U.S. presidential decision to use or not use nuclear weapons. So I realize that's not a lot of specifics, but I think the officials are going to have to work through a lot of details. And as I've said in my conversations with U.S. and Korean officials, the mood is very positive right now. We'll see 6 months from now whether the Korean officials still have a positive view. If they feel the U.S. is not being forthcoming, then we might start to hear sort of anonymous grumbles to the Korean media that things are not working out well. So I realize that may not be a lot of specifics. Sir, I may not have understood your points through the translation, but I think, as pointing out the deteriorating security situation, not only in North Korea, but with China, it has led a number of people in Korea to advocate nuclear weapons. As I cover in my paper, I think the oft-quoted figure of 71 to 76% of Koreans supporting it is incorrect. There are a number of other polls which show much lower support, and particularly once the consequences to Korean development of an indigenous program are made clear to the respondents, the numbers go down, sometimes down to 36%. And all of those polls are without ever pointing out the possible Chinese reaction. So at a time when the U.S. has requested Korea to be more forthcoming in criticizing Beijing by name for its transgressions, and Korea has been reluctant to do so, it seems counterintuitive that Korea would pursue a nuclear weapons program with offensive nuclear weapons which could hit China and not even discuss the potential consequences. But I think in counter to the advocates, there are a number of counter arguments. The consequences to North Korea, the loss of fissile material from the International Nuclear Suppliers Group, the loss of 30% of your electricity production, the automatic consequences which would occur from the International Nuclear Suppliers Group. If South Korea were to test a nuclear weapon, which one would think you'd have to do to show an effective deterrent, that it automatically requires U.S. sanctions against South Korea, which the president cannot waive, and those could lead to curtailing of defense coordination. So there are a number of consequences, and I think overall the extended deterrence guarantee is a more effective means. I realize this doesn't answer your question, but I know we're getting short on time.
Could I very quickly ask if there was a question about defense industries, could you really quickly repeat what your question was? That's what you're asking, right?
네, 방위 산업 뭐 분야도 포함되겠지만은 전체적으로 작전적 운영, 작전적 통합 운영에 관한 부분입니다. Operationalizing Integration에 관한 부분입니다. 우크라이나 러시아 전쟁에서 보듯이 무기 체계와 탄약의 문제는 굉장히 중요합니다. 우크라이나가 기본적으로 우리와 나토와 다른 무기 체계를 가지고 있었기 때문에 그들이 우리 나토에서 공급해주는 무기를 사용하는데 굉장히 어려움을 겪었습니다. 초기에. 지금 많이 나아졌지만 따라서 그런 문제점을 우리 인도 태평양 지역에서 없애하기 위해서는
I get it now. I get it. Okay, sorry. Excuse me about that. Yeah, interoperability is a problem that goes back to alliances, you know, at least since the founding of NATO. And, you know, alliances always find it very hard in order to sort of come home and centralize around a common requirements. Now, you could argue that each country, if they're going to have their own army, can sort of do whatever they want, so long as there's processes for coordinating, at least being able to communicate common operational needs and stuff like that. There is sort of this holy grail that has existed for years and years about trying to build in interoperability. Basically, there's two ways to do interoperability. All the allies basically decide on one country's product and everybody buys it, which in the case of NATO was the US always said, we made the best stuff. Why don't you just buy F-16s, M1s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and everybody will have interoperable equipment. The other, that is obviously a solution that does not appeal to many people outside the US. The other way you try to do it, which is what NATO has tried, is that you try to come up with common standards. You know, the same type of ammunition, the same type of artillery shell, et cetera, and in that regards, of course, we've done better. It's not been a universal thing, and one of the problems, of course, is that every country has unique requirements. Country like NATO, Norway, for example, Norway adds a parachute to the back of its F-16s that it had bought from the United States because it feels it needs to have a parachute braking system to land on icy runways, and that's just something common only to them. And so you're always going to face this problem. With something like Ukraine, that could be considered a unique situation because it's a situation born out of desperation. There is simply a need by the Ukrainians for just about any type of weapon system they could get. Admittedly, the logistics of trying to maintain a multi-sourced Air Force, for example, or these kind of things, are going to cause problems. On the other hand, smaller systems such as the various types of anti-tank weapons, which were so instrumental at the beginning of the conflict, they were able to basically overcome some of the problems by just simply training people on maybe just using one system and hoping that that guy is always going to be in your squad when you need him. There's an obvious desire to build more interoperability into a relationship like the US-ROK military cooperative arrangement, however I want to put it. But I think it's going to obviously require very concerted top-down efforts on the part of the governments of both countries to be able to come up with common requirements and, of course, therefore, common solutions. I don't think it's there yet. I think it's going to be very hard to achieve that. But, you know, you might be able to punch holes down in certain areas where they're going to be able to come up with common solutions that perhaps could serve as an inspiration to expand.
네, 감사합니다. 권보람 박사님은 클리너 박사님 말씀하신 걸로 가늠하시겠다 하고 최소원 박사님 마지막 코멘트 부탁드릴게요.
닥터 앤더슨이 제가 한국어를 하는 거를 본 적이 없는데 한국어로 해야지 100점짜리 답안을 목표로 답을 할 수 있을 것 같아서 한국어로 답하겠습니다. 제 선에서 말씀드릴 수 있는 것은 한 가지 우리가 풀어야 될 한미 간의 중요한 숙제는 북한이 핵 사용을 결정했고 실제로 사용했을 때 그 우리가 대응을 핵 무기로 할 것인가, 미국이 그 핵 무기를 제공할 것인가에 대한 논란이 안팎으로 있는 것 같습니다. 근데 그 부분에 관해서 핵 우산과 확장 억제 그 개념으로 설명해 드리면 좀 더 브로드하지만 정확하게 설명해 드릴 수 있을 것 같아요. 한 측의 입장에서는 핵 우산에서 확장 억제로 간 것이 미치기 재래식 무기의 중요성을 더 강조함으로써 핵 보복을 한다는 것에 선언 정책 차원에서도 말하자면 한 단계 낮은 단계의 보장을 한다고 생각하는 반면에 또 미측 입장에서는 오히려 핵 우산보다 더 가용 자산이 많아지는 extended deterrence, 확장 억제로 감으로써 오히려 한국에게 더 많은 자유도가 높아졌다. 미국과 협의할 수 있는, 또한 미국의 자산을 끌어올 수 있는. 그러니까 이것이 하나의 디스커션, 히트 디스커션의 하나라고 볼 수 있고요. 실제로 저희들이 나왔던 내용은 굉장히 상위 차원에서의 전략부터 하위 차원에서의 작전까지 다 논의가 됐기 때문에 저는 이 정도 선에서 오늘 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 정확히 4분이 남았는데요. 오늘 또 제가 사회를 잘 본 것 같습니다. 시간을 잘 맞추는 사회자가 가장 사회를 잘 봤다라고 하는데 목적을 달성하지 않았나라는 생각이 듭니다. 오늘 그 2시간에 걸쳐서 그 토론이 된 내용들을 보면 앞으로 우리가 더 연구해야 될 과제들이 얼마나 더 많은지가 식별된 그런 시간이 아니었나라는 생각이 듭니다. 그리고 제가 앞서서 이번에 특별 세션과 관련돼서 왜 특별한지에 대해서 말씀을 해드렸는데 마지막으로 왜 특별한지에 대한 이야기를 하지 않았습니다. 마지막으로 특별한 이유는 오늘 여기 그 세션에 참석한 모든 발표자분과 여러분들이 다 모두 특별하기 때문에 특별 세션입니다. 네, 마치도록 하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.